going to start with a few notes just to begin with. The first note is that I'm going to assume you understand the basics. So I'm not going to go over what a principled argument is and what a practical argument is. I'm not going to go over the general format of debating. I'm going to assume you've done a little bit of debating. You've seen those intro sorts of seminars, etc., and I'm not going to go over any of that. The second disclaimer is I'm not going to share for you the secret to writing a case or anything like that. The reality is that there is no secret and everyone does it a little bit differently. I'm just going to explain to you how I've come to figure out how I like to write cases. And obviously, if it doesn't work for you perfectly, that's fine. It doesn't have to work for you perfectly. You can change it up a little bit. This is just some advice. The third disclaimer is that this won't teach you how to write really good cases. It'll give you some pointers. It'll give you some rough structure to it. But at the end of the day, the only way you can really become a really good case writer is to first do a lot of debating, like 200 debates, and secondly, read a lot, like read a lot of books, read a lot of news articles. You actually need to know a lot of stuff to fill the arguments. It doesn't really help if you just know generally what kind of arguments you need to make. And finally, this is mainly going to cover structure, so we're mainly going to go over basic stuff like, how do you arrange the arguments? What sorts of arguments are you going to be trying to make in the first instance? How do you try to direct your energy during prep time? It's not really going to go over the actual minutiae of the debates themselves. That's a presentation for another time. So let's get started. We're going to start off by talking about generally what a case is. Then we're going to talk about what you're going to need to prove during your case. Then we're going to talk about how you're going to arrange your case. Then we're going to talk really briefly about writing the arguments themselves. And then finally, if we have any time left, I'm happy to answer a few questions. Let's get started. Cool. So, what is a case? Now, there are lots of different general definitions of a case, but in my mind, a case is just trying to convince someone whether an idea is a good idea or a bad idea. And what that means is it has to be more than just a series of disconnected arguments. Yeah, you can't just say, well, this is one reason it's good, this is one reason it's bad, this is another reason it's good, there's another reason it's bad. You need to give someone a holistic idea as to whether something is on balance, worth doing or not worth doing. So, when you're writing your case, you need to think of it as one big piece. If you have 4 practical arguments, you need to think about how they relate to each other and what they add up to at the end of the day. Because each one of those arguments likely isn't going to convince someone entirely. So it's your job to figure out the relationship between those arguments. And that is generally what a case is. It involves all elements of your speech and all elements of everyone in the team's ideas, yeah? So when you think about the really basic stuff like the arguments, you then need to think more about what you're going to do with those arguments in relation to one another. You're going to need to think about the other team's arguments, because if you're going to convince someone if something is a good or a bad idea, you also need to think about on the other side, what are the other reasons why this might be a good or a bad idea. So, given what a case is, how do you go about writing a case? In my mind, the easiest way to write a case is just to think, what do I need to prove in order to win this debate? And the reason it's important to think about what you need to prove in order to win the debate is it gives your speeches a lot of clarity, because sometimes it's the case that people will write cases where they'll just chuck in as many arguments as possible when a lot of those arguments aren't particularly constructive or never get to the necessary conclusion that they need to in order to win that debate. And alternatively, sometimes people don't think through the basic steps of what they actually necessarily need to prove in order to win the debate. And I've written in a little example just here. So imagine we took the debate that we should have a 100% inheritance tax and we took it from the affirmative. Now, I've seen this debate go out and I saw a team argue from the affirmative in a lot of depth that this policy would change norms around legacy and death and the way people feel about those things. And that is a pretty good argument, and it's a sophisticated argument, and it's a really interesting argument, but it's not necessarily an argument that's certainly going to win you the debate. It doesn't have a particularly high impact, and it doesn't necessarily sort of shape the way anyone's going to view totally if this idea is a good idea or a bad idea. By contrast, it might be really important for you to prove that this tax could be something that could even be collected in the first place, which is something that people don't really step through from the affirmative. They never really think, well, would wealthy people even have to pay this tax? Would they find ways of getting around it? Because if you don't prove that, essentially you're left with nothing, yeah? Like the enormous benefit that you're going to try to get of a huge amount of money and wealth redistribution isn't going to happen if people can just very easily go around it. And the problem for a lot of teams is that they wait until the other team points out that they need to prove that in order to prove it in the first instance. So, how do you actually go about proving what you need to prove in order to win a debate? I generally ask myself 3 questions. Firstly, what will this idea look like in the real world? Secondly, is this idea just? And thirdly, what impact will this idea have? And I find that for the vast majority of debates, if I ask myself these questions and I answer them to a sufficient degree, our team has a much, much better chance of winning the debate from first speaker, which is generally where the case is most concentrated. So what we're going to do is we're going to step through each of these questions. I'm going to explain to you what I generally mean by these questions. I'm going to explain to you what kind of specific questions you might be asking to get yourself to these answers, and then we'll talk about why they're so important to proving why you win the debate. Let's ask the first question. What will this idea look like in the real world? Now, this question often comes down to really basic understandings of what you're actually talking about. And it's really important to consider what specifically the debate is about, because that is going to radically change the outcomes of it. So take, for example, you were doing the debate we were talking about earlier about inheritance tax. In that debate, it would be a radically different debate if 100% inheritance tax was easily avoidable, or if you were really good at actually executing it. And the fact that the actual policy changes massively when you consider how it would be applied in the real world naturally changes all the outcomes of the debate, which is the reason why I typically start with this question, because it concerns first and foremost what you're actually dealing with. And you need to be able to prove that what you're dealing with is the most favorable thing possible for your side of the debate before you actually are able to really nail down what impact those ideas are going to have. So generally, these come down to, I've written 4 questions here, but there are lots. So, is this policy enforceable? Are we actually able to even do this? And if you're on the negative, you probably want to prove that the policy isn't particularly enforceable a lot of the time, and you want to explain why that means a lot of their benefits are less powerful. Or if you're on the affirmative, you actually want to step through and explain why the policy is enforceable if it is plausible that the other team might have arguments as to why it isn't. Secondly, what are the notable or strategically important features of this policy likely to be, and why? And this is really just a bunch of modeling questions. You really are just asking yourself, well, what would be the best possible version of this thing for us? And you want to think in advance, well, what could be the potential harms of it? What could be the benefits? And how can I reduce those harms? And how can I magnify those benefits? And if those things would be reasonable modifications of the model, then you should stick them in the model. And if they aren't reasonably able to be put into the model, it's really easy just to explain why someone would be able to reasonably imagine that that would be the way it would play out. And here you want to talk about why the government is likely to act in the way that you're going to talk about if you don't think you have the modeling power to just say they immediately are. Thirdly, you want to ask if this policy is going to be carried out in good faith. So, for example, if you take a debate which is about teaching radical gender, taking, how do I phrase this? Critiquing gender norms to primary school aged children, that debate would massively change if primary school aged teachers took that in good faith and actually did it well. And then we would have a totally different set of outcomes to if primary school age teachers might think this is a load of rubbish and they wanted to go about it completely the other way, and they wanted to just basically mock the policy and program, barely do it. If they do it, they do it with a lot of resentment and spite attached to it. So it's important to step through whether the people involved in the policy are likely to actually do it. And finally, you want to ask, what kinds of people will this policy affect? Because if you take the inheritance debate from earlier, if it is the case that very powerful people have the ability to avoid that particular policy, and you're basically targeting a policy towards one very specific group, it might end up the case that you will run into principled issues, or it might end up being the case that you're going to run into issues of basically the group you want to affect isn't being affected. And similarly, if you're on the negative, you can just weaponize this and say, well, the group they want to affect isn't necessarily going to be affected for this reason and that reason. And really, all of these questions are just asking you, what does this idea actually look like? Yeah, when we take it out of the abstract and we put it into the real world with imperfect people and imperfect budgets, what actually happens? And basically, you're trying to prove these two things. If you're the affirmative, you're trying to prove that the policy will achieve its intended goals. And if you're the negative, you're trying to prove that this policy won't achieve its intended goals. And the important thing to remember is often negative teams remember to do this. They remember to say, well, this won't be effective, or it'll run into roadblocks here and there. But affirmative teams sometimes forget to actually go through the work of proving why it is effective in the first place when there is reasonable doubt to consider whether it will be effective. Remember, a lot of the times the models that you're defending or the topics you're defending will be totally out there things that we've never done before. It's reasonable to spend a couple of minutes explaining to me why it's actually going to work and why it's going to work in a favorable way for your team. So once you've resolved that question, the next question I typically ask myself is this idea just? And really, basically any principled argument in any debate that's not like some, nonsense practical argument disguised as a principled argument comes down to these two questions. Does this policy infringe upon or uphold anybody's rights? So those are basic things like people's bodily autonomy, people's freedom of expression, people's private ownership, or does this policy fulfill or neglect any particular moral obligation we might have? So for instance, the government might have a particular moral obligation to historically wronged people, parents have a particular obligation to their children, and businesses might have a particular obligation to their employees. And when you're asking yourself these questions, these really basic principled questions, the important thing to keep in mind is what you're actually trying to prove. There is no use, as I put in the bottom, getting stuck into principled arguments that basically get you almost nowhere in the debate, or it's just going to be totally unconvincing. Because these arguments take a really long time to prove in any degree of depth, and a lot of the time people aren't willing to credit them particularly highly. So if you want them to credit them particularly highly, you need to be absolutely clear in your mind in advance about what specific thing you're trying to prove. So it basically exists on a spectrum, because an idea could either be morally necessary, which means that if you're able to prove your principled argument, we ought to do this no matter what, and that normally fills into arguments about people's rights. So if people's rights are being stripped away from them in the status quo, and you are able to give them those rights back, often you can frame that as being a morally necessary thing to do. And you normally want to point out that that is worth any practical trade-offs in the long run. Secondly, you can just argue that it's morally desirable. And that's just saying there are some principally good elements of this, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to do it. Now, you don't want to say we don't have to do it, but you don't want to go the way of framing an argument that just gives you some evidence to believe an idea is a good idea as one where it is morally necessary, because then the other team can just wipe it away and say, well, there are lots of times when we don't do this thing, blah, 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 blah. So you want to be clear about what it is you're actually proving. You want to say, and if I've proven to you this argument is true, basically that means that it's just another tick in our column, yeah? The third thing you want to prove from the affirmative sometimes is just that an idea is morally acceptable. So take, for instance, that debate at Worlds this year, which was about social credit scores in democracies. Now, that immediately rings warning bells from you as an affirmative or propositional government team, because probably what you were thinking is, well, this seems like it would be an invasion of people's privacy. This seems like it would be unfairly ranking individuals. It seems like we wouldn't be equitably giving out resources to basic people in our society. All these intuitive neg arguments. And the function of a principle that explains to you why something is morally acceptable is just to wash that stuff away, yeah? But you want to be really clear with these arguments that you're not arguing that it's necessarily necessary for us to do or desirable for us to do, but the point of the argument in your mind is to explain why the debate is not about whether it's principally unacceptable, but instead about what outcomes happen. So these arguments normally take the form of arguments about analogies. So you're normally pointing to other examples of very similar things that we consider to be acceptable, and then you're moving on from there swiftly. And if you're in the negative, the last two things are just sort of the inverse of the first two things I explained for the affirmative. So you're just explaining why something carries harms associated with it or is so morally unacceptable that we ought not to do it at all. And to reiterate, the important part here is to recognize what this actually does to the debate. Don't make a principled argument that just sort of like exists without an impact. The impact of principled arguments needs to be explained in a far more meta way than almost any other impact, because you need to explain the way it relates specifically to the practical material in order for anyone to take it seriously, really in any depth, yeah? And finally, I just want to reiterate again, like, don't get stuck into proving principled arguments that won't win you the debate. Like, just do the like basic check in your head where you're like, would I be convinced by this principled argument, or is it just like too far in the ether and doesn't matter? Like, sometimes you don't need a principle, you don't need to have one. All right. Thirdly, let's talk about the third question. Now, this one is easily the biggest question, and it's just what impact will this idea have? And this is really, most of the time, going to be like 70% of your speech, yeah? And what you're asking yourself is just, what does this policy actually do? Yeah, like, how does it affect the world? What happens after we do this policy? So you've first figured out what the policy looks like. You've then asked yourself, is this policy something that is necessary for us to do, or is it acceptable for us to do for a variety of moral reasons? And finally, you're then just asking yourself, well, if we then do it, what does the world look like afterwards? And this obviously can be broken down into many questions, like, what are the practical, intended consequences of this policy? How will this policy change the way people think about the world around them, and then in turn, how they then act? How will this policy affect efforts to achieve the same outcome or other desirable outcomes? So, for example, a lot of the time, arguments from the negative will explain why doing the thing the affirmative wants to do will expend the political capital required to do similar sorts of things that might get this better outcomes. Or that argument can take really simple forms of just saying, this would divert us away from the current thing we are doing, which might have better outcomes. Or you might be arguing that people will respond badly to this policy, which people often call backlash arguments, but sometimes, that can be a dismissive term. Those arguments can be good. Or you might just be asking yourself, like, what other unexpected outcomes might this policy have? That's just like, if you have any quirky ideas about how it might change the world, like, for example, the changing the ideas of liberty and death that I mentioned earlier, you might stick them here. Really, you know how to do this. You know how to ask yourself what's going to happen with the world, and there's no real secret to figuring out how it's going to change. You just have to run through these basic questions in your mind and see if it triggers anything. But at the end of the day, you're going to just have to do a lot of debates and read a lot to be able to get the sorts of like great answers that all the really good worlds debaters that you'll see will come up with. And what you're trying to prove here, as I've written, is incredibly simple. The harms of this idea outweigh the benefits, or the benefits of this idea outweigh the harms. And as I've written here, it just says, remember to keep in mind the outweigh part. And the reason that is so significant is that a lot of the time debaters will give you a set of reasons why something might be a good idea, and they might give you a set of reasons as to why something might be a bad idea. But what they won't necessarily explain to you is why, when you consider all of the reasons why something might be a good idea as a block, and you compare it to all of the reasons why something might be a bad idea as a block, it comes out one way or the other. And a case isn't just those arguments in isolation. It has to be assessing how those ideas on one side affect the ideas on the other side of the debate. And we typically call that weighing, yeah? And there are lots of frameworks you can use for weighing. You can explain why something might have a much larger impact to a greater number of people. You might explain that the impact per person is very large. You might even just explain with relation to the principled argument how that affects the way you should consider the practical arguments of the other team if they're outweighing you. But the important thing to note is that when you are weighing things, you need to do it from first, and you need to do it with a generous and reasonable understanding of what the other team is going to argue, yeah? Or if you're negative, what they have just argued, but you should have probably thought about in prep already. So you should be asking yourself really basic questions like, well, is it better to save 1,000 lives, or is it better to save 100,000 lives and extend them for a slightly longer period of time? And that is like a very silly question, and it's like a Worlds Grand Final or whatever. But if you ask yourself enough of those really basic questions about how you should consider A and B when compared to each other, you're going to come up with a bunch of clever ways to explain why one thing is better than another. And that is totally necessary when you're explaining the impact that things have. Because if you just tell me a reason why something is a good idea, I can believe you. But if I also believe the other team that there is a reason why it's a bad idea, but they do the weighing, they will almost always win the debate. And the final thing I've written here is just like, if you're negative, think about how you can work some of this into a counter model. That's really simple. It's just like, you should be spending the time thinking about what impacts the idea will have to try to work out how you can capture some of the good impacts of an idea from the negative. So if you think like, well, this topic actually has this one really good benefit, if you can just come up with a similar policy that doesn't have all the harms that you're going to talk about, you can just say, we would do this instead. Now, remember, when you have a counter model, it's really important to explain to me exactly why it is the case that that counter model is allowed in the debate. You can't just do whatever you want from the negative. You need to explain why it comes from the same pool of willingness and resources that the affirmative is drawing from. So, once you've asked yourself these three questions, what you should have in front of you is just like a bunch of things that you need to prove in order to win the debate. And now you have all of the things that would be necessary for you to prove in order to win the debate. You can work backwards and figure out how you're actually going to prove these things. So once you've figured out if you need to prove whether an idea is morally acceptable or not, once you've figured out whether you need to prove what something actually looks like, and once you've figured out whether you need to prove whether the harms outweigh the benefits and you have some reasons why, what you should have in front of you is a set of things. But there's more, because once you have that set of ideas in front of you, you now just need to take a brief moment to consider your opposition's arguments, because there is nothing worse than an affirmative team that just sets up a case that has really no preemptive material to deal with how the other team is going to deal with it. And the negative is, that is also true of negative teams. So like if negative teams don't think enough in advance about what the affirmative is going to run, and then their case just doesn't really address what we've heard so far, you just waste a lot of time at the start of the debate. Now, when you're being preemptive, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to step by step, line by line, construct your case so it deals with all of the arguments you think they're going to do. Just think about what are the most likely ones, what are the biggest impact ones, and try to rejig your case so they can, in advance, deal with those ideas. Preemption isn't rebuttal, it's just kind of like a helpful way to restructure your speeches and give some weighing in advance. So, now you've got a bunch of arguments in front of you. The second step is normally putting it all together. And it's worth noting at this point is that once you're pretty good at doing that first step, this second step should actually really only come maybe like 4-5 minutes into prep. Yeah, like that first step, despite being a lot of content, should be things that you'll get very good at just running through in your head very, very quickly. You'll have a whole team behind you who are also thinking about very similar things. And now, the second step, which should be a relatively short step, is just figuring out how you're going to frame that entire case, how you're going to structure it, what order you're going to do. So the first thing you do is assemble the set of claims you have in front of you into coherent arguments, because like there's no use having like 12 separate claims you prove if they're not grouped together in a way that's understandable. And then the second thing you want to do is order those arguments. So like just stick the best one at the front and the worst one at the end, basically, but we'll talk about it in a little more depth. So let's start with assembling arguments. There are generally 2 tips I have to assemble arguments, because you'll have like a bunch of claims in front of you. The first thing you want to do is group those claims together, either by what impact they have on the debate or what impact they have on the world. Now, typically, the kind of grouping them together by what impact they'll have in the world is the bigger one, yeah? So like people will typically group things together by saying this will affect this group, this will drop crime by this much, this will make it so people believe this thing, and drop all the claims they have to support that under that. But the other one you can pursue is just grouping things together by what impact they'll have on the debate. So if you believe you have a set of 3 arguments that don't really neatly fall into any broader categories, but all of them demonstrate why the affirmative team have a much higher burden on their side of the house, or they all prove why the affirmative team's principle is relatively unimportant, those things that you've explained do have actual outcome-oriented structure to them. And it's really helpful to just sort of organize your arguments under it. And the reason in general you want to structure your arguments by outcomes is it gives the adjudicator a lot of clarity about where you're going. So if they understand from the start that the next 2 minutes they're going to hear is all going to explain to them that crime will rise, then they're prepared for that. And they understand where these arguments are actually going and the point of all of it, and it helps them sort of have a lot of clarity as they go. By contrast, if you just sort of order them sort of nebulously, so like the first thing you'll explain is like, the first thing I'm going to explain is the principle. People don't really have any idea where you're going, and it's easy for them to get lost along the way. And the second thing I'll note is really obvious, is just give your arguments those titles that explain their specific importance to the debate. So it's like no use if you have outcome-oriented arguments, but they're still just explained to me incredibly nebulously from the start. So at this point, you should have roughly assembled your claims into a set of arguments. Now you've done that, you just need to order your arguments. And there are really just 2 things you need to keep in mind when you're ordering your arguments in the debate. Excuse me. The first thing you need to keep in mind is that arguments, no matter what, need to be placed in the order that they occur logically. So if argument B relies on you having proven argument A, then argument A needs to come before argument B. So, for example, if you're proving in the example we give earlier of school teachers deconstructing gender norms, if you have 2 arguments, one of them is that kids will now become more sexist, and another one is teachers will teach this very poorly, you need to argue the second one before you argue the first one, because the second one is a natural conclusion of the first one and requires that groundwork in order to operate. If you don't, that first argument will basically seem incoherent or missing until you have done that second one much later, which will overall weaken the argument in the eyes of the adjudicator. And the second thing to note is that arguments should just otherwise be ordered from most important to least important. That way you end up spending the most time on the ones that matter the most. They're sort of they feel more important if they're at the start of them and people understand where you're coming from. And the important thing to note here is that that means you don't have to do that thing where you stick a principle at the start of every single argument. Like, if your principle has just the impact of making something seem more morally desirable, but it's not overly important, it can just go at the end of your speech, yeah? There's no reason why it has to go at the start of your speech, and there's no reason why you should just sort of be chained to that very old, boring logic from the 1990s. Just put the most important stuff at the start and the least important stuff at the end, as long as it's in an order that makes logical sense. So, now you've put it all together, what we're going to do now is we're going to run through a brief example case that I have written. It's not perfect or anything, but it just sort of demonstrates to you the way you can run through these questions in such a fashion that you can arrive at a case very quickly. So, let's say we have the topic that we should legalize vigilantism in high crime areas and we are the affirmative. The first thing we would think about is that, well, what does this idea look like in the real world? Because vigilantism could look many different ways. It could look like people running around at night with guns just shooting anyone they see, or it could look like relatively more organized groups of individuals who are safe. And obviously the second one is much more preferable for you. So you realize in advance that you're going to need to prove that vigilantes will be safe doing this, they will be effective at what they do, and they will not commit unnecessary acts of violence. So now you know in advance that is the thing you will probably have to prove in the debate. Because a lot of the practical conclusions that you're going to reach about crime going down or any benefits about messaging will rely on you first having proven that vigilantes are going to be basically the good versions of vigilantes and not the bad versions. And here I've just written a dot point about just one thought I had about why that might be the case. And I was like, well, if they were safe, effective, and didn't commit unnecessary acts of violence, they would probably have to be well trained and they would probably have to be well organized. So, if they're going to be well-trained and well-organized, we need to think about a reason, either a reason that would be true, or we need to think about how we can work that into the model. But that's something for a little bit later. The second question you're going to ask yourself is this idea just? And you need to think, well, is it the case that we're going to be able to prove that this is a morally necessary thing? Am I going to be reasonably able to prove to someone that if we don't have vigilantism in high crime areas, that would just be absolutely abhorrent? It doesn't matter the impacts. It's totally necessary for us to do this. The answer is probably no. You just need to ask yourself the real person check of, is anyone going to believe this? Am I going to be able to convince them of it? Am I, as someone who probably needs to watch a case writing video, going to be able to convince someone of that reasonably? The answer is no. So you work out that probably what you need to prove, given the fact that vigilantism goes against many of the things that we consider to be morally acceptable, is you need to explain why it is acceptable for an individual to be a vigilante in a high crime area. And the thing here to remember is whenever you're demonstrating that something is acceptable, you need to be really specific to the context you're talking about, right? Because often the context is going to help you. The context is probably there in the topic to give you a reason to believe that this is something that is not totally crazy. So I've come up with two really brief reasons. The first is just that this is a reasonable extension of principles of self-defense. This is just like defending yourself, which seems really reasonable to most people. And secondly, that the government has lost their right to prosecute that individual for doing anything like self-defense for the reason that they have not kept them sufficiently safe and they haven't done a good enough job of getting rid of crime in that area. But note that those two reasons, I'm really clear of what it is that they're proving for me here. I'm clear that in my mind, this is just proving that it's acceptable for us to do this and we can move on to whether therefore it's going to make the world a better place or not. Which leads me to the third thing I've thought about very briefly as I'm writing this case, which is what impact will this idea have? And I realize that, well, it's a debate about crime. It's probably a good idea to explain that crime will go down. And secondly, that it's probably good to explain, if we're talking about vigilantes, that it's going to have to relate to the way the government performs crime in some meaningful way. So I know that I need to prove that crime will go down or the government will do a better job at preventing crime in the first place. And as you can see, I've dotted some really basic reasons why that's the case. But it all comes down to me first figuring out what is necessary for me to prove and then me figuring out how I can go about proving that. And that second step is actually very easy when you have 3 people around you and you've heard enough debates and you sort of understand the basic logic of these things. The harder thing to think about is what is necessary for you to prove in order to win the debate. So now I have this set of ideas in front of me. What I do very quickly is I just kind of rejig it into a case and try to organize it into something that makes sense logically and coherently. So what I've done here is I've just stuck some of the stuff about the way the world looks into the model. I've then run a principle first and foremost. And the reason why I've run the principle first and foremost, even though I said earlier that you don't have to, is that it would be necessary to prove that an idea is acceptable before you prove that that idea it has good outcomes. Because if it is not acceptable, those good outcomes aren't really anything that it is worth considering. So I figured out that it is logically, it has to go in front of the other stuff. Then I've just ordered the next 2 points by the structure of like the most important to the least important. And you'll notice that at the start of the point about why this policy will massively reduce crime, I've kept in the piece of characterization about vigilantes will be safe, effective, and not commit unnecessary acts of violence. Because that would be a thing that needs to be true in order for me to believe that vigilantes would do a good job catching criminals and they wouldn't just be crazy. So I've shifted some of the material I have about the way the world looks into the material about how it impacts the world, because those 2 pieces of analysis are necessary for them to lean across each other. So that's just an example of how it all works. I did this very quickly, but the point is that even doing it very quickly, at the end of this, what I am left with is a case that just now needs to be filled in and proved. And that is essentially what you want to be doing with the first 5 minutes or first 10 minutes of your prep. You want to, at the end of it, have a set of claims that, if proven, you will necessarily win the debate. So the final thing we're going to talk about is just writing the arguments themselves. Writing the arguments themselves, in my mind, is basically like another 5 presentations, because very specific arguments require you to argue very specific things. They require you to have a lot of knowledge. They require you to go through in depth a whole series of models about how to write arguments properly, which is the reason, weirdly, why in a case writing seminar I'm not going over particularly how to write each argument themselves. But I have got 4 tips. I know I've written 3, but there are 4 here, so I'm going to go through them. The first tip I have for writing arguments, particularly when you have a case that is as outcome-oriented as the ones that I typically like to generate, is that the clarity of your ideas is the most important thing that you can possibly add to the case, yeah? Like, if people have the best idea in the world, but the adjudicator does not understand it, you will lose the debate every single time unless you have like an insane amount of rep and they figure they don't understand it just because you're so much better than them. But that's not too common. Like, not all of us are like, you know, Eden. But actually, she's incredibly clear, so that's probably a bad example to choose. But the point is that you want to focus first and foremost on using really simple language. You want to signpost really heavily at the start of your point. So give me a map of what your point looks like before you explain the point itself. So say, at the end of this point, I will have proven to you X, Y, and Z, and you will come to this conclusion. And as you're going, use just really clear structure. Like, be like, so there are 2 reasons why this first claim is true, and after those 2 reasons, what you know is this. And just step things through in a way that even someone who had never seen a debate before in their life would understand it. Obviously, the trade-off is you don't get to be as efficient because you have to spend a lot of time on doing things like explaining, you know, unnecessary parts of the speech. But as you get better, you'll realize the parts of it you can drop away that aren't totally necessary for the clarity of your ideas. The second piece of advice I have for writing the arguments themselves is prove things. I've written here, prove things to as much, but it should be to the degree that they need to be proven. And what I mean by that is some arguments are incredibly intuitive and really only have one bit of proof behind them. So for example, the argument that we ran earlier, which was just about crime will go down because vigilantes will catch criminals, is basically proven with those 2 sentences alone, yeah? Obviously, you need to do some setup to prove why vigilantes will be the kinds of people who will catch criminals well, but the actual proof of that argument is just they will catch the criminals, therefore there will be less crime. And even though that point has a lot of impacts, it doesn't mean that the analysis behind it needs to be gone on forever just because it's an important argument. So what you should do is prove things to the limit that they need to be proven and then stop. That will help you a lot with the efficiency of that argument. The third thing I want to say is that you need to explain your arguments and explain why your arguments are important, and not just to the real world. So not just do the basic impacting stuff that we went through earlier, but to the debate themselves. And a good friend of mine told me that it is the case that points need to be a balance between analysis and impacting, which means that you should be thinking, when you have proven something is true, have I also proven if that thing is important? And if you believe that you spend a lot of time impacting, think to yourself, have I proven if this thing is even true? If I have proved it's important, that doesn't necessarily matter, because if someone doesn't believe it, it obviously won't sway the debate. So ensure you spend the time explaining to me why things matter to the debate, not just why they are true to the debate. And the final thing is, if there are any obvious objections to your arguments, preempt them within the argument as you go. So if like a piece of analysis in your argument has a very obvious response to it, stop and say, now the other team might say X, our response to that is Y. There is no reason why you should let your argument be weak when you could just do the work in advance and give yourself much more time as a team to respond by injecting the responses from the other team right into it. And the easy way to tell which parts of your arguments need to be preempted, because obviously you don't have the time to preempt everything, is just to ask yourself, if I said this part, every step and every premise of this argument to the average reasonable person, which part of them would they be most likely to scrunch up their face and go, what? Well, that doesn't make sense. And at that part, spend the extra time going into the adjudicator's head and saying, well, they might be thinking this, they might be thinking that, and just explain to them why that isn't a necessary, a satisfactory response to your argument. So that just about does it for me.